the American Revolution, and welcome to you all here tonight. I'm just curious if you could show me who is visiting for the first time tonight to the museum. We're going to forgive you as long as you're first time. I know Gary will give us a good shout out later on about how wonderful the exhibits are. So I just wanted to introduce you to the museum. You know, this is a town where sixes are really important. 1776, the 76ers. We have welcomed our 600,000th visitor in under 2 years. In the past year, we've welcomed 60,000 school children. That's just in organized groups of school children, not those who come with their families, obviously. We have 6,000 members in all 50 states and in the armed forces serving overseas. And I hope those of you who are just learning about the museum tonight will kind of look into becoming members of the museum. Not the least because it puts you up front for programs like the one we're really excited to launch tonight, which is actually part of a series that we call the World Affairs and the Enduring American Revolution. We were really excited when Craig Schneider, who's president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia, kind of came to us with this idea to partner, understanding that the museum here is really dedicated to the idea that the American Revolution is not just a quaint story set in the past. It's not just a war that established American independence, but it is really just the first act of the great drama, that we are still living in an experiment in self-government, and we want to be a place that we can explore the enduring American Revolution, the relevance of the story we tell upstairs with the times that we live in today. So I'd love to invite Craig up to introduce the program this evening, but thank you all for being with us here this evening.
Good evening, everybody. I want to thank Scott and the entire team here at the Museum of the American Revolution. World Affairs Council of Philadelphia is really delighted about this new partnership. This is our city's newest and really quite wonderful attraction and educational facility. We are looking forward to continuing this partnership for years to come. Also want to thank all of you here for braving the weather. I thought we might have a little more attrition than we did, so it's great to see that everybody is hale and hearty. As we talk about this series of events between the two organizations under the title of World Affairs and the Enduring American Revolution, I think that this partnership between the two organizations captures extremely well the idea that the purpose of the American Revolution was then and remains now to ensure the blessings of liberty to posterity. We aim to continue that mission, if you will, in our discussion tonight and in all the work that the two organizations are going to do together. Let me just do a couple of quick words about upcoming council events. On Wednesday, February 27th, we're hosting the former governor of Colorado and widely assumed candidate for president in the Democratic presidential nomination sweepstakes for 2020, John Hickenlooper. We are going to be offering our podium this year to many of the candidates in the Democratic presidential field, which means we're going to be really busy. We've done this in presidential cycles, primary cycles going back many decades. And we do hope that the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia will be one of the venues in which the issues for the coming election are shaped and explored. Then on Monday, March 4th, we're going to be hosting former New Jersey Governor and Republican presidential candidate Chris Christie. We hope you can join us for these and other exciting events that we'll have coming up during our spring season as we continue the ongoing celebration of this 70th anniversary year for our organization. Turning to this evening, we're really excited to host this distinguished group of guests to discuss one of the most important and troubling, vexing questions of our time, the global rise of authoritarianism. We will begin with some keynote remarks by Gary Kasparov, In addition to, as you all know, being recognized as one of the greatest chess players in the world, in the history of the world, Mr. Kasparov is chairman of the Human Rights Foundation. He's an activist and an author on these important subjects to be considered tonight. Following those remarks, we're going to turn to a panel discussion that will also include the author of The People versus Democracy, Associate Professor at Princeton University, Yascha Mounk, and Professor of Law at Stanford Law School, Curtis Milhouse. So with that, we'll get underway. Please join me in welcoming Gary Kasparov.
Good afternoon. It was a fascinating trip, just very fast. So I'm sure I should come back, bring my daughter, 12-year-old daughter, who is a big fan of history, especially US history. But while just walking around here, I thought that it would be appropriate to talk about history in our talk, because things are connected, and unless we learn from the past, we cannot secure our future, and we are experiencing troubles in present days. I recall the moment, I don't know, 2 a.m., 3 a.m. in the morning, November 9, 2016. My wife looked at me. I mean, I knew what was happening already about 7 p.m. when I saw the betting line drop from 89% to something like 70%, and I told my daughter to just go to bed. Yes, it's not for you to watch, you know. We looked at our website, and the first message I received there was coming in Russian, in Cyrillic, and now, okay, set aside the cursing. So basically it said, we're going to run now. So a lot of people, you know, they assumed that, you know, Trump, strange, unflinching devotion to Putin could create problems for people like me, who had no choice but to leave Russia and just to stay in the country of freedom. And then I thought that November 9, actually, it's quite a day in history. When you go back in the 20th century, it's probably the most important day of the whole century. 1918, the end of the World War I. 1923, Beer Putsch in Munich, the first attempt of Nazis to seize power. 1938, Kristallnacht. 1989, collapse of Berlin Wall. By the way, 1985, Gary Kasparov became the youngest world champion. And I thought that, you know, it's important for us to actually look back and just understand, going back to the 80s, great moments, you know, it's 1989, the Berlin Wall went down, expectations about the future, they were just running so high. The most popular book, I think in 1992, or just actually it was an essay and a book of Francis Fukuyama, The End of History. Liberal democracy has won. History is over. The rest just, you know, will be a celebration. I think we should go back and just learn, you know, just the lesson of this, very painful lesson of this 25 years, actually more than a quarter of a century, that the evil doesn't disappear, it doesn't go away. For a while, it could be buried under the rubble of the Berlin Wall. But the moment we lose our vigilance, the moment we turn to be complacent, it sprouts out. And we're here at this conference to discuss why. Why we see the rise of authoritarian regimes, dictators, thugs, terrorists in the world. Well, in 1991, 1992, the world was, you know, just could be built by American model. And again, we thought liberal democracy has won once and forever. I think one of the reasons here, and I probably should apply my chess knowledge, is to talk about strategy and tactics. It's quite striking just for me to hear every time that, for instance, oh, Putin plays chess, Obama plays checkers. The moment I hear phrase Putin plays chess, I rise to defend the integrity of my game. Because it's set aside the fact that in chess we have rules. Rules are fixed, results are unpredictable. In Putin's Russia, it's exactly the opposite. Rules change all the time, result doesn't. But it's also important to understand that the main advantage of democracy over dictatorship is continuity, means strategy. Because one administration can start the project, the plan, can just lay down the foundation for the future, as was done by Harry Truman's administration. And it could take decades before the end of the Cold War, before the victory, which was again started by a Democrat, ended by the Republican president. But the institutions could be built, rebuilt if necessary, but there was a continuity. It didn't depend on just on the person. Yeah. Dictators, they cannot afford to be strategic because it's all about them. They go, everything goes. They don't care. But they're very good in tactical responses. If you play this game, very sharp game, as we say in chess, when it's all about tactics and strategies set aside, you're doomed to lose. Because they don't care about the Senate approval, the Congress, parliaments, press, public opinion. They can respond very quickly. And so we have to make sure that we have a plan. And what's happened in 91, 92, I believe, there was no plan. We were caught in this, I think caught by surprise. It's the Soviet Union is gone. So it's time to celebrate. And the free world, and America as a leader of the free world, failed to come up with this global vision. So what's next? It's the end of one chapter. So what's going to happen in 10 years, in 20 years? And when Bill Clinton took over in January 1993, America was all powerful, no more enemies. When Bill Clinton left the office in January 2001, Al-Qaeda was ready to strike. So it tells us that it's without plan, we'll always cede territory and initiative to bad guys. And again, bad guys will always be around. And what's the difference between enemies of the free world today and what we had in the 20th century is that the free world, first time in history, has overwhelming advantage, militarily, economically, politically, but we don't have the same will to fight back. And the bad guys, they know that the only way for them to survive politically is to defy the free world. Putin knows that he cannot survive in an open military conflict with NATO. He doesn't have to start a war with NATO. He can thrive through these small conflicts, what they call hybrid war. Don't forget, his background is not military, but KGB. And he could gradually just push the free world back. Because dictators, they never ask why. They always ask why not. If they could grab a little piece of territory, perfect. If they could squeeze some concessions, absolutely fine. I remember that it's just in 2013, before Sochi Olympics in Russia, I spoke to a Canadian journalist and I compared Sochi 2014, the Winter Olympics, with Berlin 1936. And she jumped on a chair and said, how can you compare Putin to Hitler? I said, the problem is, when you say Hitler, you think about Hitler from history books. What about Hitler from the newspaper publications in 1933, in 1934, in 1935, in 1936, in 1937, in 1938, even in 1939? So it's New York Times, Toronto Star, London Times, Le Monde. They all talked about Adolf Hitler as it's not, not our kind of a guy, but we have to respect the choice of German people because he's turning Germany to be great again. It was there, By the way, just as a matter of curiosity, I found out the first time the American press mentioned Adolf Hitler. Anybody can guess the year? 1922. It's a tiny, tiny piece in New York Times talking about an obscure nationalist party in Germany. And the whole idea of this little, a couple of paragraphs is That's the whole idea of the party it's very nationalistic, anti-Semitic, but of course you shouldn't take it seriously. It's all for, for domestic purposes, for just elections. Just, it's a political tool. So disregard this statement. Many did. And sometimes reading the stories of the 30s, memoirs, and the great book of Winston Churchill, The Gathering Storm. When you read about, not 38, forget Chamberlain, 33, 34, 35 debates in the British Parliament, erase names, and you can just hear the voices that are just surrounding us, actually have been surrounding us. Because after November 9, 2016, things have changed. And I'm going back to my wife, she said, Gary, great news. Now they will listen to you. For so many years, you have been shouting in the desert, and the response was, it's not about us. It's Russia, Iran, China, you name it. It will never happen in America. Are you so sure? I remember that in May 2015, just before I published my book, Winter is Coming, I was invited to Bill Maher's program. And I tried to talk about Putin, and he was very dismissive. So he got tired and sick of me trying just to bring Putin, and he said, quote unquote, wake me up after he takes over Poland. I jumped on my chair saying that the last time in history we heard this similar statement, it ended with the greatest disaster, the greatest tragedy in the history of civilization. Of course, after November 9, he has changed his mind. Of course, after November 9, almost every program has been dedicated to Putin's interference in American elections. And I couldn't help teasing him on my Twitter, saying, Bill, by the way, it seemed Putin decided to skip over Poland and went straight to Wisconsin. Actually, a few days ago, I had a chance to sort of reiterate the message after Senator Klobuchar from Wisconsin, made a semi-announcement of her presidential bid, and she stated that there was very little campaigning in Wisconsin in 2016. We're going to change it now. So my Twitter response was, not entirely true. Putin campaigned very hard in 2016 in Wisconsin. So, and what's happened here in 2016, and I don't want to concentrate on this too much, is it was logical. It's not just, for me it was not if, it's only when. Because we could see Putin, as every dictator before, eliminating any opposition inside Russia and looking elsewhere. Because dictators, they need enemies. And bigger enemies means stronger dictatorship. And while Russian economy just was falling apart, and it's just currently Putin's regime can no longer support the living standards of Russian people, they have to buy the loyalty of the elite by demonstrating the invincibility of the dictator. And the best way is to defy the strongest power on the planet. And I have to give him credit. He's excelling in this performance. The story that also many of you probably remember, Vladimir Putin, a sudden trip to New York to the General Assembly of the United Nations in September 2015. I got a call from, I think it was, his speech was scheduled on Monday at the UN, and I got a call probably on Wednesday from the Wall Street Journal asking me to write about Putin's speech, Putin's appearance. I said, absolutely fine, I can deliver my article by this weekend. So wait a second, the speech is on Monday. I said, I didn't have to hear what he's going to say. I can tell you why he's here. Now, okay, we negotiated, so eventually I just submitted my article later, but I was right. It was not about Putin's speech there. I don't think he cared what he said. It was not even about him meeting Obama, it was about one picture. Maybe you remember when Putin met Obama, and Obama reached out, and Putin paused for a few seconds. It's a gesture. Obama is reaching out, and Putin is just almost, he's full of contempt, but he had no choice. That's the message to the Russian public. Vladimir Putin had to go to New York. He had no choice. It's United Nations General Assembly. He was in the belly of the beast. He had to meet American president. he had to shake his hand. The next day, the Russian plane bombed American-backed rebels in Syria. That's the message. That's how you create this aura of invincibility, and he's quite good at that. And the world is now it's all connected, because we say, oh, it's Putin is there and then ISIS is there, and it's not. You cannot separate them, because we live. Globalization means that everything is connected. You think that Obama's decision not to act in Syria, had an effect only in the Middle East? No. And I remember I said it quite a few times, being confronted by those who are today trying to be more hawkish than I am. And I said, look, it will ripple effect just throughout the whole world. I didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but I knew, it's like a domino. And so what's happened? Putin saw the opportunity. He seized the opportunity. Russian planes destroyed all the strongholds of the opposition, bombed, carpet bombing of Aleppo, maybe some of you remember the images. They pushed refugees to Turkey. And by the way, Erdogan, who was at that time, I think, sitting on 2 chairs, he saw, but decided, why not? If Putin could do that, so what about me? I could just be the same, so I can follow. So there's no punishment for these kind of actions. And then the refugees had to move to Europe. And who benefited? Alt-right. The far-right groups that Vladimir Putin always supported, because he knew they would be helping him to in his campaign in Europe, and all of them, surprise, surprise, wanted to leave sanctions against Russia. Result, Germany, 1 million refugees coming out of the blue. First time in history, the rise of neo-Nazis have not been connected to the economic hardship. German economy has been thriving. But still, the third largest party in Germany, Alternative for Germany, AfD, a neo-Nazi party. 94 neo-Nazis in German Bundestag. Syria, Turkey, Europe, and I could start counting other countries. So the sad irony is that the images of these refugees have been used not only in Germany, but in the countries that never seen a single Syrian refugee, like the United Kingdom. The Brexit campaign used these images of Syrian refugees to scare the British population. Donald Trump used these images. Again, there was a handful of Syrian refugees that made it to this country. But it's an effect that you cannot limit by one region or another. So that's why it's very important for us as to understand that unless we have a strategy to confront the rise of authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, we will not win. You cannot try to win separately war against ISIS, against Al-Qaeda, against Putin, against whoever. So it's about the challenge. And it's very important for us to come up with the global vision. I was born in the Soviet Union on the other side of the Iron Curtain. So the way I saw the world was quite different from many of you. Just because, we looked at America and we expected, one day this country to help us to be liberated. I know that people could have different views about US presidents, but from our perspective, the best US presidents since World War II were Harry Truman and Ronald Reagan, for a simple reason. For them opposing communism, one stopped it and another one destroyed it. I'm not here to argue, I could be wrong, but it's just the way people saw it from the other side of the Iron Curtain. And right now, the problem in this country is that people have very little hope, because they could see that the world is in disarray. They just, they could see that right or wrong, but Putin is winning. And when I say Putin, is more like a figure of speech. They're winning because it's all going their way. The free world has no vision. The free world is fighting against each other. And that's the biggest accomplishment of Vladimir Putin and his gang. Unlike Soviet authorities, unlike Soviet communist propaganda, he was not trying to sell you an idea, about bright future. I always call Putin merchant of doubt. And he found it a very effective weapon. You don't have to convince people that this ideology is the best one. All you should do is spread doubts and spread chaos. So you have to put people against each other. And unfortunately, he was quite successful in doing it across the free world. So I hope that today we can just, we have this debate about how can we fight back. And unlike Cold War, this is not a war that has geographical border. There's no more Berlin Wall. There's no more Iron Curtain. In this war, just it's now going on within free society. And I think having the right vision of the future is very important. And don't just say that, don't buy the stories that, oh, so many people are just, are happy with dictatorship. So many people are just, they believe that, they don't need democracy because it doesn't work. Nonsense. So for those who say that there are nations that are not ready for democracy, nations that genetically not yet, they're not grown-ups, so they just have to just go to kindergarten before they could actually enjoy the benefits of democratic education. I mean, look at Korean Peninsula. In 1953, the country was divided. They were not even cousins, brothers and sisters. And now, 65 years later, you have two different countries, probably two different nations, because South Korea is even taller and bigger. On one side, in the north, you have a gulag, the the ugliest human prison on this planet, run by the most brutal dictator. In the south, the very same people built one of the most successful market economy, liberal democracy. They impeached their president. They imprisoned the CEO of the largest corporation. Many lessons we can learn from them. Who says that Koreans were not ready for democracy? There was not a single day of democracy in Korea in the past. Those who are admiring China, oh, look at Chinese model. Yes, but we look at big China. What about the tiny piece of China called Taiwan? Same Chinese people, far more successful. So, and I could just tell even more about Russian-Ukrainian war, because for those who think it's a war between Russians and Ukrainians, I can tell you it's more likely it's a war between Russians born in Russia and Russians born on the other side of the border. Russians who knew what would mean Putin's rule in these territories, and the core of Ukrainian army fighting against Putin's invasion, ethnic Russians that didn't want, just to experience the same, all the pleasures and beauties of Putin's rule in their country. Ukraine is still suffering. It's a corrupt state. There's so many problems there, but they're free. And the difference between Ukraine and Russia, going back to 1990s, simple. Since 1994, Ukraine experienced the change of the government, not by bullets, but by ballots. Since 1994, Ukrainian presidents steadily losing elections. So Ukrainians know that they can, remove the guy they don't like by voting. In Russia, we failed. It's time to understand that this failure, maybe, I don't like those who say it's all predetermined. But we were not ready to move forward, and we definitely were not supported by the rest of the world again, because there was no plan. I think now we're reaching a point where we have to look in the future, and we just have to learn from these lessons last 25 years, and to come up with a plan. And can tell you, as someone who just has been traveling constantly around the world, so we can look at Europe, we can look at other countries that have steady democratic governments, whether it's Japan or Australia. But at the end of the day, it's unlike the United States recovers its leadership position, and will just send the message across that you can rely on the United States. Nothing will change. From 1946 to 1991, everybody knew that America, no matter who was in the Oval Office, the Republican or Democrat, is a reliable ally or a determined foe. Since 1992, it was more like a pendulum. Everything could change with the occupant of the Oval Office. And so unless America turns to be a stabilizing force with the vision of the future, so I think we'll be experiencing more turbulence. Thank you.
on. Thank you so much. Well, as befits a keynote address, Gary's laid out many issues that we can follow up on, and we'll try to unpack some of them. So let me start with this. There's a sort of mushy version of the story of American history and American democracy that puts a bunch of ideas, a bunch of principles all together. One idea being the idea of majority rule and elections to determine who has power in a society. The second idea being human rights, the protection of individuals. And the third, the idea of national self-determination and the independence of peoples. There's a sort of mushy version in which all of those are part of the same thing, right? And by promoting this thing we call democracy, we get all three. It seems to me that one can argue, looking at the world now, that those three things are very much in tension. Maybe they always were, but they seem to be becoming much more in tension now. Let me start with the first two, right? We have a lot of countries in which people are being elected following the process of majority rule, who then seek to curtail minority rights, who seek to curtail individual rights, who seek to curtail the protection of civil liberties. We have the idea of national self-determination being used as a cover, if you will, in many cases, for abuses of human rights. So my question, and I want to start with you, Yasha, is how should Americans think about the relationship among these values, and how does that affect our own policy going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I was actually reflecting on it while we're having drinks over there in the Hamilton exhibit, which had a very nice section about the Federalist Papers. I love teaching the Federalist Papers to undergrads, in part because it explains so much about the nature of the American experiment, but in part because it challenges some of their assumptions about what our political system is. I was discussing Federalist Paper number 10 with somebody a moment ago, which has this brilliant insight that the problem which has led to the ruin of every attempt at self-government is faction. And the right response to it is not to try and control factions, not to try and eliminate them, which would be, in this lovely phrase by Hamilton, by Madison actually, a cure that's worse than the disease. It's rather to multiply factions. It's to make America so big and so diverse that nobody can ever hope to have a majority outright. And so we have to all agree to rules by which we can sort of broker our disagreements. But the Federalist paper that I love teaching most probably is Federalist number 61, which is a little more obscure. And it's because of one line which really pushes my undergrads to rethink what this country actually is. It is where the founding fathers explicitly say that they're not founding a democracy, which is defined by direct rule of the people. They're founding a republic, which is defined by, I quote, the total exclusion of the people in their collective capacity from any share in the government. That's not how we think of our political system normally, right? So how do we make sense of that? Well, I think we have to remember that our political system has two key instincts, and one of them has become stronger over time. And at this point, we really want both. Any political system that's going to be legitimate has to involve both of those. And the way that I usually capture them is to talk about a liberal democracy, or you can also talk about a constitutional republic. There's different ways of putting the point. So the liberal element of this has nothing to do with liberal and conservative, with George W. Bush versus Barack Obama. In that sense, as you were saying, all of the presidents since 1945 have been liberal. And it is that we want to be in a place in which we have individual freedom, individual rights, in which we can say or not say what we want, in which we can worship whichever God we choose in the way we think right, or not worship at all, in which we can decide how to lead our private lives. And for that, we need individual rights, and we need the rule of law. But then secondly, we also want some amount of real collective self-determination, that all of us together are not told what to do by a dictator, or by a king, or by a priest, or by an imam, but that together we figure out our political fate. And as you were saying, for a long time, political scientists have assumed that these two things naturally go together. But actually, they can really come in tension and fall apart. Majorities of people can vote to deprive individuals of their rights. And demagogues, populists, can come up and say, I alone represent the people. Anybody who disagrees with me is illegitimate. And so if the press starts to criticize me, we should be able to shut them up. If the opposition doesn't want to vote through a law that I advocate, then they're traitors. If the courts try to stop something I do because it's unconstitutional, then they're the enemies of the people. And so these are ways in which the democratic element of our political system can be turned against the liberal element of our democratic system. And the problem with that is twofold. The first problem is that it deprives us of those liberties, which are one of the key promises of our political system, along with the democratic element. It creates what the founding fathers would have called the tyranny of the majority. But the second element is that it actually turns itself against the democratic element itself. Because when you no longer have independent institutions, when, as you're seeing in Russia or in Hungary or in Venezuela or in all kinds of other countries around the world, the elected prime minister or president starts to have his loyalists in the electoral commission and on the courts and in every other institution, then you can no longer get rid of them by democratic means. So eventually the democratically elected ruler turns against democracy itself.
Okay, let me stay with this a little bit and bring Curtis in on the issue of China, which is the sort of the elephant in the room, right? The Chinese are now explicitly talking about being an alternative model, and they're saying, look, we had Tom Friedman from the New York Times speak a couple of years ago now, and he told this wonderful story about an escalator that was broken in the Washington, D.C. metro stop that he uses all the time. And he went to China, and he came back, and he went to China a few times during this time. And he said in the time it took for the escalator to get fixed, the Chinese had built cities. They had built high-speed rail for 1,000 miles. And basically, the argument, I think, that the Chinese Communist Party is now making is, we're the model. We're effective. We are lifting people out of poverty. We are creating quality of life. And democracy seems to be unable to get out of its own way. The escalator being a tiny but perhaps relevant example. How do you bring the Chinese model idea into this conversation about liberal democracy?
Well, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Very honored to be here. I think this is a very important question. I think China challenges some of the fundamental assumptions that went into the making of the post-war global order largely under U.S. leadership, and I think it does so in a couple of ways. Directly on this point, one is by challenging some of the fundamental assumptions about how the world works. For example, that a rule of law is a fundamental precondition for economic development. The idea, this is a long-held notion, that you need neutral enforcement of contracts by an independent judiciary. You need legal constraints on a government to serve as a bulwark against incursions by the government into the private sector. China is not a rule of law country, and yet it's managed spectacular economic growth over the last 20 years. How has it managed this? Well, that's a much longer talk than I could give in a few minutes. But if you look at historical experience, what China has accomplished is not unique. Think about South Korea under military dictator Park Chung-hee in the 60s and 70s. Think about Chile under Augusto Pinochet in the 1980s. These were regimes that essentially staked their legitimacy on delivering economic growth. And the leader, the authoritarian, used his political power and political will to credibly commit to economic growth. So this gives rise to this notion that there is a countervailing narrative, that there's a Beijing consensus, if you will, that serves as a contrast to the liberal democratic order, free trade regime of the so-called Washington consensus. Another fundamental assumption is that economic development inexorably leads to democratization of society. The idea being that development produces a middle class which demands civil society organizations, which eventually serve as a bulwark against the state. And South Korea, as Mr. Kasparov mentioned, is a shining example of precisely that path. China has not yet followed that path. China has been, essentially the regime has cut a deal with the populace. Don't challenge the regime, and we will give you freedom to get rich. We will give you economic freedom. They've coupled this with relentless suppression of organized dissent and, of course, systematic censorship of the internet. So this has given rise to this sense in the world, which is attractive to people like the leader of Turkey, et cetera, that there is this this other path that's possible. And I would just add one other thing, which is that there's a more concrete manifestation of this alternative path, which takes the form of Chinese state-owned enterprises. So it might surprise some of you to learn that 120 Chinese companies made the Global Fortune 500 list of the largest companies in the world last year. More than half of those were Chinese state-owned enterprises. These are enterprises whose controlling shareholder is the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party. These firms have Communist Party cells within them, and so they're a kind of transmission belt for Chinese industrial policy and Communist Party policy. And the last point I would just simply make, going back to this notion of challenging the world order, is that the global regime for trade, investment, antitrust, et cetera, simply did not contemplate this type of actor, this fusion of economics and politics. And so, to Mr. Kasparov's points that we need a plan. Well, we need a plan in this area for confronting this very new type of economic actor.
I'm going to do something very foolhardy, which is that I'm going to argue for the importance of Hungary over China, which seems very unlikely because Hungary is a small country of 10 million people, rapidly depopulating and part of the old world in the center of Europe, whereas China has over 1 billion people, much bigger GDP. So let me explain why I think that Hungary is actually in some ways more important to our understanding of the challenges we face in China. And it's to do with the fact that I don't quite buy that China is an alternative model to us in the United States. Right? China is very important in terms of its global military reach. It's very important in terms of its economic might. In a paper that I'm currently writing with a colleague, I'm showing that for the first time in over a century, the GDP of autocratic countries taken together is higher than the GDP of liberal democracies. 10 or 15 years ago, there was no universities in the top 200 which were in autocratic countries. Now there's a lot of them, including ones in China. So in all of those ways, China matters. But I don't buy that we can copy China. Why? A, because China works quite well in practice, but is a complete mess in theory, which is to say that if we were to set out to copy the model, we would have to create a communist party that's been hanging around for 75 years and owns half of our companies and is actually quite capitalist in weird ways. It's impossible to do that. And B, because I don't think that if you go to the average American and say, look, we're going to have the affluence of China and so on, you just have to tolerate, 98% male communist party where everybody wears the same bad gray suits, you're not going to win a majority of the elections.
These days, good gray suits.
Well, that's okay, fair. The quality of the gray suits has been rapidly improving. But Hungary shows how you bridge from democracy to autocracy. In Hungary, in 3 elections in 2010, Viktor Orban was elected. This is a country which was consolidated according to political scientists, which is to say it had changed governments of free and fair elections a whole bunch of times since 1990. It was rich enough to be considered consolidated by political scientists. And yet, by claiming to become more democratic, to make the country accord more the will of the Hungarian people, by saying, when people criticize me, that's not legitimate, so let's just expand my power a little bit because I actually speak for you. I'm going to give power back to you. Orban has been able to establish a dictatorship right in the heart of the European Union. So I think when we're thinking about ideological alternatives to democracy, populism is this crucial link which can win elections in democracies and then establish a dictatorship, which is something that the Chinese models, for all of the importance of China as a country, can't do.
Let me end this debate about the values, because the book that I signed 250 copies today is that you have with you, it's Fight for Liberty, is just presented 30 essays coming mainly from the members of our new organization that I helped to found more than 2 years ago, after November 2016, you can guess, called Renew Democracy Initiative. It's a quite unique organization that features people from both sides. You can hardly find another organization that has a board, people like Larry Tribe on one side or Brett Stevens on the other side. And the idea is actually to talk about the values. What values bring us together? So it's in this hyper-partisanship atmosphere. So when nobody wants to talk to the other side. So how can we help to rebuild the political central that has been decimated and to stop the rise of radicals on both sides? When you have the far right attacking liberal democracy and far left attacking the market economy. And it's actually brings me just to the issues that we were touching, obviously just on the surface, about democracy and liberty. And there's an interesting trivia question: is that when you look at the three major documents, founding documents of modern democracy, the Bill of Rights, the British one in 1688, Declaration of Independence, 1776, and the Declaration of Right of Man of French Revolution. The question is, how many times these three founding documents mention democracy? The answer is none. Zero. The word democracy is not there because the founding fathers, whether in Britain, in America, or in France, recognize that it's not about tools, but it's about rights. So it's about securing rights of people. Because as we could see, Hungary and many other cases, Erdogan also won elections. So it's just winning elections. Putin, 2000, okay, still question mark, but there were some sort of elections. Dictators, by the way, love elections. They talk about democracy. They always use adjectives: sovereign, managed, whatever. So but it's not about democratic institutions that secure elections, but it's about the rights of people to be protected no matter who is in the office. And that's what makes America so different and so successful. And briefly about China. Most of you remember Cold War. The world was divided. So there were, bad guys on both sides. We had countries supported by USSR, dictators, and dictators supported by the United States. You had so-called right-wing dictatorship and left-wing dictatorship. It's not I say, he says, whoever says. It's about history and the lessons we can draw from history. Every right-wing dictatorship, no matter geography, climate, race, religion, has been peacefully transformed into market economy and liberal democracy. Chile, South Africa, Spain, Portugal, South Korea, Taiwan. Not a single left-wing dictatorship, no matter race, climate, religion, nationality, has been peacefully transformed into market economy and democracy. Eastern Europe should not be considered as a good example because the countries were occupied by the Soviet Union. So it was not homegrown dictatorship. So I think it tells us something about certain relations within the society. And I believe it's about private ownership. It's about protecting the families and certain values that never disappeared, whether under Pinochet or in other, right, or Spain or the Franco. And those values that have been on a molecular level have been virtually destroyed by communist rulers. I always compare communism as some sort of geopolitical HIV virus. It destroys immune system. And every virus then can actually kill you. That's why when you look at the former communist countries, so many of them are totally defenseless against neo-Nazis' rise. So the most active or most productive area for AfD in Germany is Germany. So and by the way, Hungary is another example. So that's again, it's Orban. It's not that far yet, but it's still, you can smell. That's the smell of Nazi propaganda is there. And again, it's a former communist country. So that's why I wouldn't worry so much about China, because it's unless you have economic progress combined with political transformation, then it's a threat. But we could see actually China, while improving economy, by the way, being export economy. So domestic consumption in China is still, it's very feeble. But politically, it moves in the opposite direction, from collective leadership to one-man dictatorship. And that's a bad sign for China, because the moment you shift from collective leadership they had after Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping one-man dictatorship, that means that he doesn't care anymore about the country. It's all about him surviving, which means he could start doing things that could contradict the long-term development.
I would just say I agree with that completely, and I think one of the reasons that China succeeded under its system of authoritarianism is that the authoritarianism was institutionalized. It was collective leadership. So I agree with you completely. The move to remove term limits for Xi Jinping is a very bad sign for China.
Okay, so I hear a consensus of a sort that if Americans are trying to protect the legacy of the American Revolution, we should focus on human rights rather than the formalities of elections. That the formalities of electoral democracy can produce illiberal democracy that attacks human rights. So, but there is an argument that I hear increasingly in some circles that says that the Western definition of human rights, as it continues to evolve, is another form of colonialism. That non-Western cultures may reject what they see as the imposition of Western values, particularly on the most sensitive matters: the role of women in society, the role of sexual minorities. Are you open to the idea that the definition of human rights is culturally conditional?
No. And I think this is one of those weird spaces where sort of the most reactionary elements of society and the most woke weirdly start to touch, because there's something sort of oddly Western imperialist about that argument that you just bring up, and I'm glad you did, because it's saying, well, we here in the West are enlightened, and we obviously would never tolerate anybody who's in the least bit homophobic or any of those kinds of things. But how dare we impose our great enlightenment on other countries? So if people in other parts of the world choose to stone to death homosexuals, or to put it more precisely, if some dictator in another part of the world chooses to stone to death homosexuals, that's their choice. Well, it's not the choice of the people who are being stoned to death, for once. So at some point you have to ask, what is your basic unit of moral analysis? And for me, the basic unit of moral analysis is the individual. And the individual should have those rights to lead the life in the way that they want to, wherever they are in the world. And by the way, sorry to say, there's gay people everywhere in the world. And I don't think that gay people in any society in the world say, I'm happy to live in a society where if I act on my most basic natural instincts, I'm going to be put in jail or I'm going to be killed. So I think it's important for us to fight for these values. Now, that doesn't mean that we should impose them on other places. It doesn't naturally lead to one conclusion or another about what the most sensible foreign policy is. I think there's all kinds of debates we should have about that. But definitely, insofar as I can help to ensure that the most basic rights of people are protected, I'm very happy to do that, whether they happen to be in a country in the West where people have white skin, or whether they happen to be in a country that's not in the West where people have different kind of skin, because I think that human beings have a lot more in common than divides them.
I would just say I certainly agree on a personal level. I absolutely agree with that, as does the audience. I think it's, though, useful to recognize that there are parts of the world where the individual is not viewed as the primary force or actor in society, that the group or the family is perceived to be more important than the individual. These tend to be Asian countries, and you hear about Asian values and the like. I'm not defending that view, but I think it's legitimate that some of the emphasis on the individual can be legitimately downplayed. Now, that doesn't mean that people can be tortured or imprisoned, et cetera, for no reason. But I think there is a different sense of the importance of the individual vis-a-vis society. Going back to China for 1 second, if you talk to Chinese about this point, the response you will often get is hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty through the Chinese regime. That is a form of human rights, this sort of individual development or development through economic development. I'm not defending that, but I think it's a countervailing perspective.
Yeah, and I think that there's a bunch of sort of false dichotomies there, right? I mean, absolutely, economic progress is one of the most important things in the world. And by the way, I'm somebody who's on the left. I think left-wingers sometimes are not appreciative enough of globalization, because one of the most tremendous things we've achieved in human history is having lifted 2 billion people around the world out of poverty over the last 20 years, right? If you care about poor people around the world, you need to celebrate that. That is an incredible piece of progress. So that's absolutely important. I don't think that that's intention of democracy, because actually when you look at evidence across countries, there's some very good examples of autocracies creating wealth, but actually on average, democracies do much better than autocracies, and that's true if you include China in the sample as well. The second point is, look, I think when you take the extreme argument that, some countries just don't value the individual, you could have said the same about Germany in the 30s and 40s. You could have said the same about most European societies until quite recently. And it turns out that once you establish liberty there, they want to have those kinds of individual rights. Then there's a question about how much people value family. Do they pursue sort of money for themselves and all of their own choices, or are they closer to their family and so on? There's definitely a value in that. I think you can recognize that by still taking the individual as a basic unit of society. It's true for debates about identity in the United States as well, right? We need to defend the rights of groups in the United States 100% and without compromise. When people are targeted on the basis of a skin color, on the basis of a religion, on the basis of a sexual identity, it is incumbent to us as bearers of the values of the American Revolution, by the way, to stand up for them. But why is it? It's not because we should care for different groups, for whites or for Latinos or for African Americans as groups. It's because these groups are constituted by individuals who choose to give significance to those groups and who should not be targeted or discriminated against because of that choice.
I think when we discuss American history, I think we should remember it's not something that exists in a vacuum. You should compare it against the rest of the world. Yes, many things were wrong, but we should look at every event, whether it's happened during American Revolution or afterwards or Civil War, and to just recognize that a lot of people who acted at the time, and we do not approve today what they did because we know they were wrong. I think it's just trying to apply modern standards of 21st century moral to Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, or some people in New York after watching this famous musical Hamilton, saying, no, it was not good. He couldn't press Jefferson and other Southerners to abolish slavery. Yeah, imagine he could press. That would be, that would divide the country in two, and by the slavery will be flourishing for another 100 years. So we just recognize that there's certain things people can do based on political reality and the moral standards of a day. And they change. What is very important, how they change. It's about trend. I would measure success by the reduction of violence in the society. It doesn't happen as very quickly as we want. But if you look at American history, there were bumps in the road. But unlike any other European nations, it's steady improvement. Yes, we know about Native Americans, but are they better off than 150 years ago? Yes. Women, are they better off than 100 years ago? The first time they voted in 1920? Yes. Afro-Americans, are they better off than 50 years ago? Yes. Sexual minorities, are they better off than 25 years ago? The answer is yes. Not perfect. We still, it's a long way to go, but compared to the rest of the world, it's a steady road. I wouldn't call the shining city on the hill, but it's a move, and that's what we should celebrate. Yes, there are a lot of people in the Civil War on the wrong side, but many more white men were on the right side of history. So I think that's why it's again trying to reconstruct history and just and blasting some of the great men who were instrumental in creating this great nation. So because they did something we don't approve today, I think that's wrong. So, but equally wrong trying to pretend that they built a system that is perfect. I disapprove originalism the same way I disapprove this criticism, because this it was the middle 18th century. So when they had the Second Amendment, so it took 2 minutes to reload Kentucky rifle. Now in 2 minutes you can kill 500 people. So it's just, and I understand why they wanted the Supreme Court judges to have the life tenure. What was the average lifespan? 45 years? Not 85. So it's as we hear this exhibition they created a living mechanism, a living body that we should upgrade all the time. So definitely there are values that we should keep, but just remember that it's not a sacred cow that we cannot touch.
I'd love to add a point to that because that was excellent, I thought. And there's sort of these different basic views of American history, which, both as we try to grapple with how we can tell a unified story of America that actually might unite us rather than divide us in this moment when our nation seems to be falling apart. And as we're in this beautiful building, a museum, and this exhibit really is astounding, isn't it? It's wonderful. I think there's sort of three basic views of American history which lead into three basic views of American identity. And one of them is to say that America has always been wonderful and perfect, and any sort of little blemishes are something we can sort of scurry over and ignore. And so today there's no real work left to do in our society because we've overcome slavery, we've overcome Jim Crow, and there's nothing left to worry about. I think that's overly triumphalist and overly quietist. Unfortunately, the history of injustice and the history of slavery has been baked deeply into our nation, and today all kinds of real injustices remain that we have to fight against. So that's too simple. Now, the other polar opposite of that story is to say that the history of America has always been a history of injustice. It's always been a history of inflicting oppression and suffering on other people. And we should disown the symbols of our nation. We should only recite the history of our nation as a list and the litany of sins to be atoned. And I think that's overly simple as well, because as Gary very movingly put it, the history of our nation has been a history of moral progress, bumpy moral progress. But there's no doubt that our nation is many, many times better today on just about any metric than it was 200 or 50 or even 25 years ago. And so I think instead, we need to have a middle path, which is acknowledging the deep ways in which injustice and suffering were part of the American story. But the fight against that injustice was an even deeper part of our story. And that fight
Fight
was,
against injustice shaped the nation.
Yeah.
And
it was always a fight which involved many different people, of many different groups. I loved a line in Cory Booker's announcement video a week or so ago. I understand we're not quite in New Jersey here, but we're close enough. So careful, yeah. Everything I said up to now is entirely uncontroversial. But,
You're pushing it.
But so he was telling a moving story of how his parents were the first to desegregate a neighborhood, to move into a neighborhood that had been reserved to whites. But he included a little line that invited everybody into the story, right? Because this is a story of heroism of his parents, who were black, obviously, and of the leadership of African Americans in the civil rights movement, which is their movement. But he added a little line into this introductory video saying that they were aided by a bunch of white lawyers who had been inspired by Martin Luther King, and it flashed a little photograph of the lawyers who had helped his parents. And this is something that Barack Obama did all the time. In this beautiful, moving speech in Selma, Alabama, he emphasized the importance of Jim Crow in our nation's history and the amazing achievements of the civil rights movement. But he also emphasized that this was Americans of all creeds, of all religions, who had stood together in that march. And so I think there is this more complicated history we can tell, which we acknowledge how deeply injustice has shaped our nation, but also claim that our nation is even more deeply shaped by the fight against it. By the way, I say our because I had the privilege of becoming a US citizen in March of 2017. Thank you. And it's because I still retain this hope that of all the societies in the world, ours has the best chance of becoming a truly fair and multi-ethnic society, one in which it actually works. And we shouldn't forget how close we are to making that work. And the last thing I'll say on that is that it was a particular pleasure in March of 2017, for reasons which you can put two and two together yourself, to swear together with 200 people from all around the world to defend the American Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
So I want to, I really do want to bring this conversation home and talk about domestic issues in a minute, but I want to stay on foreign policy for just a moment, on global affairs, if you will. We've just heard from this panel really inspirational words about human rights and about progress. But it is hard not to think that there is not a wind blowing against our understanding of human rights in the world. Gary laid out in his remarks, a theory of the case in which Mr. Putin, through actions in Syria, has managed to destabilize democracy in the whole continent of Europe. We know about the rise of China and its apparent ambitions. And you can look elsewhere in the world and see retreat from Brazil and so on. The list is long. So I want to go down the line and ask, and this is a big question, why? Why is it that we're seeing a retreat?
Well, I think it starts with our present leadership. We're in a period of unilateralism, and I think that's a very dangerous moment at this particular time, where there are challengers, and there are serious challenges to the global regime that's been built into our way of life. And so I think that we need to move back toward multilateralism. That's a personal view. I mean, I tend, as you recognize, I focus on economic issues and economic regulatory issues. I think there are issues when I said we need a strategy, it was emphatically not to say that we should be copying China, absolutely not. The point is that we need to collectively figure out how to deal with a very different type of economic actor and political actor in the world. So I think multilateralism is the issue. It's not going to be easy, but if we throw it out the window and if we give up on it, I think it's a very dangerous time for that to be trying to build it alone in the world.
Again, going back to China, so it's want to copy China here in America. Who will be America to buy all the goods produced here? Because America's rise to greatness was due to domestic consumption. Before World War II, America keep growing, based on domestic market. So there's very little foreign trade. Now, there was some, but it just was not before the end of World War II. It was not a major factor. So that's why, again, it's China could keep growing only as long as America and the rest of the free world buying Chinese goods. So it's with all the Chinese skyscrapers. So this is, I don't think they'll stay for too long, without a limited supply of US dollars just that pay for Chinese labor. And also, again, speaking about these hundreds of millions of people there's that word driven out of poverty. There are, I don't know about 100, but definitely tens of millions of people who keep suffering the injustice. What's about Uyghurs now? You have, Chinese government has been discriminating. Probably it's a genocidal policy against tens of millions of people. That's because they live in Western China. They speak different language. It's a Turkish group, and the world pretends that it's not a big deal. This is not genocide happened 200 years ago. It's happening now. And at the same time, speaking about big American corporations that are so bravely fighting, like Apple, FBI, we will not let you have access to terrorist phone. By the way, I support this view. The same Apple is willingly to open data on millions and millions of Chinese to Chinese government. There's thousands of Google's engineers signing petition not to work as Pentagon and Maven. It's a cloud system that could support autonomous weapons because they don't want to do anything that can hurt people. The same Google is working on so-called Dragonfly, the system that would allow Chinese government to connect social media accounts to private phones. Are you telling me it's not going to hurt people? So I think it's just we should look inward. We should understand how we influence one way or another the rest of the world. And it's very important for us to have certain moral issues. It's not, we cannot have the globalization without moral issues. We're so strongly defending this here in America or in Europe and pretending that the rest of the world, it's irrelevant. And I speak on behalf of hundreds of millions of people who are just, we're not lucky to be born in America. They were not lucky to immigrate to America. They still live in Russia, they still live in Iran, in Turkey, in China. And from the Google, Microsoft, Apple perspectives, they are not as worthy as American citizens. And I think it's time to start ending these double standards and this hypocrisy and say that globalization means that we'll respect human rights no matter where people were born and where they live.
And I think that's exactly what the danger is of saying, human rights are just a Western construct, so you know, if human rights are in any way threatened here in the United States, we're bravely going to stand up to it and we're going to hold our employer accountable. But if our employer is breaking human rights in some other country, well, that country is somewhere else, and who worries about that, right? I think you're exactly right about that. So to the question of how is it that this is happening, I think we have to split the question into two slightly separate parts. I think the first question is, why is it that individual rights are coming under attack within the world of seemingly stable, established global democracies, within the kinds of countries where we thought that we had secured them for a very long time? And there I think it has to do with the fact that there was an elite consensus around some of those things. And that elite consensus could sustain itself as long as most citizens gave the elites the benefit of the doubt. And why did they do that? Because they saw the system working. Because they had achieved very rapid economic progress. In the United States, the standard of living of an average American doubled from 1935 to 1960, and it doubled again from 1960 to 1985. Because the countries seemed to have good judgment, because they didn't have any great military humiliations, because things worked, because the escalator at the metro station got fixed. Right? And I think now a lot of people within democracies are saying, I no longer have that benefit of a doubt that I'm going to give the political elites, because they seem to have started some pretty bad decisions in foreign policy, because there's been a huge economic crisis that nobody really anticipated and nobody was held accountable for it. Because since 1985, the living standard of an average American has not risen at all. It's been stagnant. And so why should I give them the benefit of the doubt? And if some loudmouth comes about and says, I'm going to fix it all by just beating all of these assholes you don't like up, they're going to say, well, let him beat them up. He might not be able to get me the thing he promises, but at least they'll get beaten up. So that, I think, is the story of how it is that these enemies of liberty can rise within seemingly stable democracies. And then the second half of the story is that obviously empowers and enables autocrats around the world, who were always to some extent held in check by the fact that the United States didn't have a consistent exclusion on just working with democracies, but always had a preference for democracy. And they always pushed semi-democratic regimes towards more democracy. And now that's no longer the case. Here's a question, since we've barely named the person who shall not be named. I get that Donald Trump likes Vladimir Putin and that he likes Rodrigo Duterte, the president of the Philippines. Why?
And Xi Jinping and Erdogan.
Well, no, so that I don't get, you see. So I get Putin and Duterte. Why? Because they're exactly the sorts of guys he would like in the United States. With his brash, macho assholes. Right. But Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping are nothing like that. Those are the exact people who Trump would hate if they were American. Xi Jinping is the guy who, would have gone to the same college as Trump. I think that was here, wasn't it? And he would have done much better than him. Xi Jinping would have gotten straight A's, right? And been liked by the teacher, right? This is not the guy who Trump would usually like. I mean, Kim Jong-un, obviously Trump would look down on, you'd call him a fatty or whatever, right? So why does he like them? Because he consistently likes them because they are dictators. It's not that he likes other things about them, he forgives them for being dictators. He likes them because they're dictators. And so suddenly the United States lets all these people do what they want. And in fact, Trump sometimes says, oh, Kim Jong-un, he's a really tough guy, became president of his country at 33. Yeah, because he inherited the throne and killed his brother.
You give too much credit to Donald Trump.
I've been accused of many things in my life, but none of this.
No, because he gave him ability to actually understand the difference between Putin and Xi Jinping. It's all about his envy. He's jealous. They can do whatever they want. He doesn't care. Turkeys. All he could see is people that don't care about the parliament and about all sorts of, negotiations. They just bingo. They can sort out all the things. They can do shutdown one after another. They can kill people. They can move people. That's a dream. But it's just, how can you seriously, just believe in the judgment of a person about other individuals? I think he has his Andrew Jackson portrait in his in Oval Office, or just in his study there. I mean, knowing from what I know about Andrew Jackson, I mean, guess what he would do with this sleazy New York real estate dealer? So the first to be hanged on the first tree, for dirty dealing. But Donald Trump doesn't know about it. He just heard something about a tough guy. He wants to be like them, just without understanding at all. It's all about, I want to act, unrestrained.
I agree. For the record.
Okay, so we've named the unnameable. Let's stick with the subject. Let me play devil's advocate. So devil's advocate would say.
Do you mean that literally?
No. The case for the other side, to put it differently, would say that declaring Donald Trump to be an authoritarian, declaring his administration to be sort of in a continuum that includes also the Putin and various rulers of that sort around the world, is essentially just a rejection by a certain point of view within America of an election result that can't be accepted, that can't be abided, and that some of the solutions that have been, or reforms that have been proposed, abolishing the Electoral College, abolishing or fundamentally changing the rules of the Senate in order to arguably correct for the problem of the election of Donald Trump, are in fact anti-democratic. There's a substantial group of Americans that believes that the rightful winner of an American election under our legal process is under illegitimate attack by people who just can't accept the results of the election. So how do we reframe American democracy so that these two camps can talk to each other?
Well, I think that the start, which is really important, is to distinguish between areas where a lot of us in this room may happen to have deep normative disagreements with Donald Trump, but where he legitimately is putting forward some point of view that we may dislike, but that doesn't violate the basic principles of the American Republic. And then to look at the things where what he does is to attack the basic principles of the American Republic. So I'll give you one example, right? I mean, the Trump administration is trying to reduce by various means the number of legal immigrants to this country. I disagree with that. I think legal immigrants are one of the great strengths of this country. I think even more highly...
I'm one of them.
Yes. I think even more highly qualified people should come into this country. I think we should actually expand H-1B visas, right? But it is democratically legitimate. It may be wrong normatively. I'm willing to fight against it, in my columns and so on. But it's perfectly democratically legitimate for the government to pass a law that says we're going to reduce the number of whatever visas that this country grants, right? We should not attack that as undemocratic. We should argue against it if you disagree with it. But that is a legitimate thing for a president to try and do through normal democratic processes. When he says a judge who happens to have Latino roots is a so-called judge, right? When he attacks the opposition as enemies of the people, when he says he might not be bound by the outcome of an election, when he says that his opponent in an election should be locked up and put in jail, those are attacks on basic principles of our democracy. Now, Trump is not at this point Erdogan or Chavez. The American Republic is very complicated. Thankfully, we don't have one national electoral committee. We have thousands of different committees in different parts of the country administering elections. We have a very active civil society which sustains institutions like this one and debates like this one. we have all kinds of things that we can use to defend ourselves against that kind of autocratic drift. And so far, we've done quite well at that, by the way, which we should be happy about. But Trump is taking steps 1 and 2 of the sequence. We've seen people like Erdogan and Chavez taking those steps 1 and 2 as well. And if we let him take steps 8, 9, and 10, I think it's pretty clear where it would lead.
I couldn't agree more. I think this the coup d'etat in this modern time is not necessarily tanks on the streets. It's just one tiny change after another. So that's what we saw in Russia. That's what we saw in Venezuela, by the way. That's what we saw in Turkey, just to a certain point. So we're just limiting freedom here and there, just creating some opportunity for party loyalists or for those loyal to dictator to gain a little bit more power here and there. So I think American democracy is strong enough, and Trump, as if you consider him a virus, so it's weak enough to kill the body, which ideally should make the body stronger. But it's very important to understand that Trump is more like a symptom. So we could see the accumulation of executive power in the Oval Office for decades. And we here just believe that many things just, they're based on code of honor. Of course, any candidate should reveal his or her taxes. Of course, he shouldn't do that or shouldn't do that because nobody did it before. So what? So the lesson of Trump is an important lesson is that, we just have to, forget about this code of honor and start, just write it's carving in the stone. So just, make sure that these laws, that they're protected not only by the spirit, but by the letter. Yeah. And so the many things were, I could see dangers, but I think the danger is also very psychological. It's a fragmentation. What Trump does, as I believe as Putin's asset, is he's dividing the society. And he's quite good on that. So it's quite an irony to see that technology that has been invented in the free world, all these devices that we carry in our pockets and purses, has been wisely used by the enemies of the free world to undermine the very foundation of the free world. And we yet to find the antidote for that. So, and that's why again, I don't think we should play this game. It's elections, yes, the rules were absolutely clear. So it's not about popular vote. It's about electoral college. I think it's outdated, but so what? It takes time before we can change it. So that's why we should not try to attack. And I think it was wrong, by the way, attacking Donald Trump from these positions, because it gives an argument for those who are defending him, say, they are just against the foundation of the republic. So it's going back to Renew Democracy Initiative, our organization, it's very important that I should bring together people who can agree on the changes that are very important. And by the way, one of them is to limit presidential powers. Yes, those who say, how can Trump, even think about imposing state of emergency to build a wall? From the left, I hear that, I agree. By the way, I want you to say that your president will never use the same power, will never declare a state of emergency, for instance, to fight climate change. But make sure that the limitations of powers will apply to no matter who is there. It's about principles. And I think that's what's happening under Trump is now, it's all about, he's a bad guy, we have a good guy or just a good woman. So we'll do it differently, but we don't want, we don't want him to use his powers, but we can use them wisely. No. Just make sure that, it's generic. So these changes are generic.
I would just add, I'm in complete agreement. There's a difference between policy differences and attacking the fundamental institutions of society. But I think our institutions are resilient enough to withstand these attacks. And we're already seeing the separation of powers coming into play. Congress itself, Republicans in Congress are against Trump declaring a national emergency for precisely the reason that you said. They believe that the separate power of Congress is important. We've seen John Roberts clearly make statements that suggest he's concerned about the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. So I think the framers did an amazing job at creating a set of very resilient institutions. So I guess I'm pretty optimistic that we're going to weather this and that our institutions will survive.
The only qualification to that I would make is that, how do I put this? If it was a populist Olympics, Donald Trump would not make medal rank. When you look at guys like Orban and Erdogan and Putin, I was talking to Tony Blair about Vladimir Putin once, and he said, this is off the record, I think this is playing somewhere, but never mind.
It's not off the record.
I was talking to an imaginary British Prime Minister. And apparently his comment, he had this first meeting with Putin probably sometime around the year 2000. And as soon as Putin walked out of the room, he turned to his staff and he said something along the lines of, that guy's going to do all right for himself. It was obvious from the beginning that this was a very, very shrewd, disciplined, smart guy who's good at strategy. You disagree, by the way. But, Trump is not that. Right? I mean, there's all kinds of things that Trump does that just harms himself. The fact that he has paid out money to a porn star, the fact that there's so many things he does which weaken his position a lot. And Congress has already proven to be far less good at standing up to Donald Trump than you might have imagined. Even for Trump is very unpopular. Imagine Trump had 50-55% approval ratings. Imagine that he cut out the least popular things he does. Imagine that he tweeted a little bit less, just when he can actually stab his opponents in the eye when they did something stupid, rather than picking silly fights every day. That would be a real test for our institutions. And I think the last 2 years have given us a mixed message about that. It did show that our institutions are pretty resilient, but it also showed that in some ways they're much weaker than we would have imagined. And so the real fear, as Gary was saying, is that Trump is the symptom, not the cause. And this kind of thing is going to come back if we're not careful. And it comes back in the form of somebody who could take bronze in the populist Olympics. I'm not sure how well we're going to do it at withstanding.
I criticize you mildly for giving Trump too much credit, but you should not diminish him too much. You said he kept failing, but he kept failing upward. And ended up in the Oval Office. I mean, let's not forget it. So is this failure after failure? 45th President of the United States. Even with his failures, it's just...
Well, with Gary 1-1, and now he's sitting here.
It's we say it's failures, but still this virus is contagious. And it's just, look, he's there for 2 years, and there are more Republicans who these days trust Putin over FBI. Republicans. It's somehow he has, his way of, I think what he's doing, he's normalizing abnormal. He's just, all of a sudden, certain things, it's a normal language. And it's just, and because of tweets, again, the same. So he can keep doing that. And now we just, we forget about scandal yesterday because he, as, by the way, a classical would-be dictator, he comes up with a new scandal every day. So maybe he doesn't even understand it, but we should give credit for this technique that created so much mess and division in this country, and fragmentation. So, and now he's there, hopefully, it's the last 2 years or probably less, but it's very important now to start thinking how we can eradicate all the reasons that made Trump possible, to prevent another one, someone who could learn from Trump, someone who could be having bronze or whatever medal in this populist contest, and will use the weaknesses. So the system that is, we know it's after almost 250 years, anything is getting rust. So the system should be strengthened. So just to make sure that the Republic will withstand the political winds of the 21st century.
Okay, we're going to open to questions from all of you. Start over here.
This is a question for Mr. Is that question for Mr.
Question for Mr. Kirschbaum. You alluded at the end that you think Trump is a Russian asset. Do you think he's a useful idiot or the direct kind?
We'll find out. No doubt about it. Look, it's just I don't know the answer to this question. Again, it's useful. It's a stronger statement because again, he ended up in the White House, and he just he came after one bankruptcy and after another bankruptcy, and he just always ended up just staying afloat. even if I couldn't read a word, of English, or without even understanding what's being said, Russian is my native tongue, and I could see Vladimir Putin talking about Trump, whether with Trump or without Trump, just talking about him. I met enough KGB lieutenant colonels in my life to tell you that this is the way they always talk about their assets. That's the way Putin could be contemptuous about some other foreign leaders, but when he talks about Trump, you could see this blink in his eyes. That's the biggest success. Actually, I think it will be proven to be the biggest disaster because they help to unite American society, but that's another story.
Okay, come over to this side, gentlemen, please.
I'm going to try to very quickly squeeze in two. You mentioned earlier, Professor Monk, that you use the individual as sort of your basic unit of moral analysis, which is a basic tenet of liberalism that we tend to believe on the left and right, even if we disagree on the best policy outcomes to pursue individual liberty. A very buzzy book from this past year is Why Liberalism Failed, where the author, whose name I'm forgetting,
Patrick Deenan, I think.
Excellent. I see you've read it. Advances the idea that there is a way in which liberalism has become corrosive, in that by making the individual the most important social actor, we corrode our sort of valuation of community and community involvement. It's a weird argument. I don't know that I completely buy it, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. And secondly, to the group, I'd be interested to know, because there was much praise for globalization and its ability to lift people out of poverty, which is undeniable. But there seems to be a way in which now globalization itself has become a weapon against free society. And when you look at the Russian interventions in our democracy, which now appears to be, involve the Saudis and, Qatar and Israel, and on and on and on, that we may need to think about the weaknesses we've opened ourselves up to as well as part of our strategy going forward. So that's two big questions, and I'll leave it to you guys.
I'm glad you asked that question because it clarifies something about how you see the world when you are sort of a proud liberal, right? A lot of people have tried to create this tension, this contrast between caring about the individual on the one hand and caring about groups on the other hand. Now, for me, as I was saying, the basic moral unit is the individual. And that means that the group is never justified in saying, we're going to sacrifice this individual against the individual's will because we as a group have a right to do that, right? We live in a traditionalist society. We as a group have decided that homosexuals are evil, so we're going to stone them. You're not allowed to complain. I don't buy that law, right? So that doesn't mean that I can't appreciate groups. Why do I appreciate groups? Because it so happens that individuals invest groups with deep significance, right? That most individuals say, my membership in my religious group, even my solidarity to my ethnic group, my love for my family are absolutely fundamental to who I am, right? I want to recognize the right to change their mind. They grow up in a religious group and they're 25, they wake up one morning and say, I don't believe any of that. They should be allowed to leave that religious group without any negative repercussions for them. But as long as they believe in that religious group, we must really care about the right to worship, the right not to be discriminated against because they're part of a religious group, and so on and so forth. Why? Because they as individuals have chosen to invest deep significance in those practices and so on, and so we need to respect those groups. Not because the unit of society is groups, but precisely because the unity of society is these individuals.
Okay, we'll come here in a
Speak to the
minute.
second.
Do you want to? Okay, please.
Okay.
Wait, microphone's coming.
Here's my question. No.
First, thank you all for coming here. Boy, this panel discussion hit me spot, bullseye. And I can't emphasize that enough. My question, please. Let's get right to the core of things, and that is, what can centrists in this country do to take this country back from, on the one hand, the self-loathing, America-loathing wokes, and on the other hand, the reactionaries? It looks like those are our only two choices now. The next question is, will the Eagles win the Super Bowl?
The Eagles will win. I know what's good for me in this panel.
Well, go. It's it's this what you described. Happened in many places, but I think the most sort of vivid example, Spain, 1936, when you have a choice between the socialist and which turned into process communists and fascists, and then everybody else in the middle was caught. So what you can do? I mean, Orwell described it brilliantly in A Homage of Catalonia in his book. So it's not just American problem, and that's why I thought it's very important to come up with an idea to bring organization that could merge these different interests. You look at the United Kingdom. Brexit helped Jeremy Corbyn. Look at France. It's not Le Pen on the Mélenchon on the other side. It's not just AfD in Germany, but the Linke. Look at Italian government. It's left populist of Cinque Stelle and neo-Nazis Lega Nord. So it seems that now this is a trend. And one of the reasons is that people lost their faith. I mean, you mentioned Brazil. Corruption. Endemic corruption. People got sick and tired of that, and that's that helps to the rise of the leaders that say, okay, we can eradicate it. So I think it's very important that again we will come up with a vision, and I think it's right now personally I believe that the two-party system, the way we knew it through our lifetime, has been exhausted. They grew too big. There's too many groups there. So I think it's going back in American history. It's what's happened in the middle of the 18th century, 19th century, 1855, when the Whigs split for Know Nothing and the Republicans, and Democrats for South and North. So I think we are about the same time where we start seeing the reshuffling of American political system. But it's very important that we recognize that we cannot have elections having radicals on one side or another. You cannot have elections with Goldwater and McGovern. So this is, and we are heading for that now. So I think it's very important that people like you and just all of us will just will start raising our voices and making sure that at least one party will have common sense not to come up with a candidate that is unacceptable by 60% of people in the middle, but they will have no choice but to go one way or another.
Just a couple of quick thoughts to add to that. I mean, I think it's really important to note that extremism of the left is not the right response to extremism to the right. When you remember Michelle Obama's and Barack Obama's line, when they go low, we go high. I do think there's now a temptation to say when they go low, we go even lower, and we must resist that. At the same time, I want to emphasize a way in which, two different ways of understanding what the center is, right? One is sort of that beautiful poem warning about the fact that the center won't hold, in which the center is, it's actually historically not exactly right, but the way the poem is read now is sort of taken to mean the set of things we can agree on, the set of institutions that can sustain our national life. And in that sense, I think it's really important that the center holds. I think there's another sense in which I don't agree, perhaps with the premise of the question, that in order for our country to go forward in a good way, everybody needs to be sort of moderate on politics, right? I think it's perfectly fine for some people to be robust progressives, and it's perfectly fine for other people to be robust conservatives. Given the nature of our country, that's always going to be the case. And I think that debate can actually be productive. What's important is that people, whether they're proud progressive or whether they're proud conservatives, can agree on how to settle their differences. What set of institutions to use in a fair way with mutual respect in order to figure out what this country should do. And so on that, I think we should all be part of a center which defends our institutions. Why? Not because we think it's bad to be part of the left or even that it's bad to be part of the right, but because we want to provide the forum in which people can fight for their ideals without everything degenerating into civic strife of civil war.
I would give a somewhat nerdy response. I'm a law professor, so it's in my DNA to be nerdy, but I think it takes you back to electoral politics. Our electoral processes right now are driving this kind of extremism, and the primary process, the endemic gerrymandering. We need an independent commission to set electoral districts. It seems obvious. So that's one thing that we could all be pushing for. I think that would be a tremendous step forward to stop gerrymandering and to change the primary process.
Even though Trump's approval ratings never really get higher than about 40%, but isn't that enough? Because the whole point really of authoritarianism is disruption. So even though he has the support of a smaller amount of the population never gets high enough, he's still disruptive. And it encourages other countries who are also have leaders somewhat like him that are also disruptive, just like Putin. The main thing there is just to keep things disruptive, to allow whatever is going to happen, which is hurting us, really, and hurting the liberal world.
Anybody?
Look, it's not about 30 or 40%. It's about accumulating power, and he done it legitimately. So it's again, he had, 25-30% in the primaries. That was enough to wipe out other candidates. Then he won the elections with, 3 million votes less than his opponent. But again, it was under the law. American political system is just, it has been divided, has been designed more than 200 years ago just to make sure that the state politics survive on the federal level. Right now, we are just, again, as following your line, Professor. So it's about gerrymandering, but it's also presidential elections. So we have 10 states. Only quarter of American population participate in elections. So the 75%, it's just basically, if you vote in California, New York, and Texas, you can stay home. So it's this. We're looking at these challenges, recognizing that, as we said, many of us said at the stage tonight, Trump is a symptom. So it's very important to create conditions where we can prevent the rise of a new Trump. So it's a Trump 2.0 that could be much more sophisticated.
Yeah, this will be the last one. I'm sorry, I can't take everybody. Take the woman in the middle, please.
Hi. I'd like to ask a question that has been answered partially but not head on. And that is, what is it that's happening globally that's producing so many authoritarian rulers now? And what is it that we can do to keep it from happening again, or from getting worse?
So I think now is a slightly misleading way to ask this question, actually, because this has been going on for a long time. So when you look at the rise of populism in Europe, for example, there was about 7 governments of populist participation in Europe in 2000. Now there's about 15. There were about 8% of the vote in 2000 on average in national elections. Now we're about 26. And this has been a steady increase. It didn't all happen in 2016. It didn't all happen after 2008. So it's been going on a very long time. And I talk more about the causes in my book, The People vs. Democracy, but I think it's to do with economic stagnation, with the rise of the internet, and with demographic change. I think those are the main factors. I also, the more I've been thinking about that, I've been thinking that it's really to do with a lack of courage and leadership among political elites. I think that's an important thing we should talk about. And so I just want to, if I may, end on a reflection about that courage and the way it's lacking in many people and the way that a few people have it. Wherever you stand in politics, and I assume that a lot of people in this crowd are somewhat similar to us, so otherwise this must have been a lonely evening, I'm sorry. You should be appalled by the way in which there's clearly a lot of Republican congressmen who privately deeply dislike and are worried about Trump, but keep going along with him. And the utter lack of courage of that. I mean, what is the worst damn thing that's going to happen to you if you're a Republican congressman who goes against Trump? You lose re-election, you'll go and become a mediocre lobbyist, or you'll go and run some institution in your home district. You're going to make 5 times as much money. You're going to have to spend half of your time on the phone to people begging them for cash. I mean, like, how bad could it get? And yet so few of them are standing up for the right thing. And that, to me, has helped me understand the process by which countries turn autocratic in a way that I couldn't have 3 years ago. Now, there's some people who have shown courage throughout their lives. In the late 1980s, there was a very talented chess player in the Soviet Union, for example, whom the regime would have liked to enlist as the young poster child of communism, and who very slyly managed to indicate how deeply he disliked the regime. once a person became the youngest, was it the youngest? I think it was the youngest. The youngest chess world champion in the world, he could have easily, turned up to fancy events and made a lot of money by playing sort of blind chess against a few people, and gone home and had a lovely life wherever he chose in the world. But he chose to fight for democracy in Russia at a very difficult and dangerous moment. And when that became, not quite and when that became really dangerous and really hard, he could have come and taken a nice apartment in Manhattan and said, well, at least I'm going to sit out when I see the same thing coming to the United States. But as a good American as well as Russian patriot, he decided to say, no, I'm going to stand up to what I see here as well because of my experience in Russia and because I see how brittle democracy is. And so I think we could all learn a little bit from the immense courage that Gary has shown for himself.
Thank you. I have to say that there were two moments in history that I could take any bets I would lose. So in August 1991, if anybody could have told me, told me that 9 years later, KGB would take over Russia again, I would be laughing loud. If anybody 15 years ago, that's actually 40 years ago when I stopped my professional chess career, decided to fight what I thought about fighting for democracy and human rights. It's not a political fight, as many thought, in Russia. If anybody would have told me that I will end up fighting for democracy in America, I would be laughing loud.
I want to thank all of our guests. I want to thank all of you for coming out. We're adjourned. Good evening.